Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's webinar, Fertilizers in a Shifting Global Landscape, Trends, Trade and Sustainability. My name is Monika Tothova, and on behalf of the Agriculture Market Information System, also known as AMIS, in partnership with the International Food Policy Research Institute, IFPRI, I am pleased to open our discussion. Special thanks to IFPRI for hosting and co-organizing this event. Later, Charlotte Hebebrand, Director of Communications and Public Affairs at IFPRI, will join me to co-moderate. AMIS is a G20 initiative launched in 2011 after the food price crisis of 2007-2008 and 2010-2011 to improve transparency on the food commodity markets. It brings together G20 members and other key trading countries. Fertilizer Workstream in AMIS is a relatively new addition from 2023, with first publicly available output shared in early 2024. While AMIS' point of entry to analysis of fertilizer markets is through AMIS commodities, which are wheat, maize, rice, and soybeans, IFPRI focuses on impacts on low and middle income countries. However, understanding the fertilizer markets and their drivers is central to both of our institutions. And indeed, in the past few years, fertilizer markets have seen quite a ride due to price shocks, trade disruptions, and changing policies. These changes affected not only fertilizer economics, but also food security, sustainability, and resilience. Today, on this webinar, the expert will explore current market dynamics and evolving trade landscape and policy approaches to encourage fertilizer use, including subsidies and alternatives. Before I give the floor to our first speaker, please allow me to remind you that to participate in our online Q&A section, you are invited to submit your questions on ifpri.org, Facebook, LinkedIn, YouTube, or by using hashtag and #AskIFPRI on X. With that, I am pleased to give the floor to our first speaker, Delphine Leconte-Demarsy from the Agriculture Market Information System, who will walk us through the current situation on the fertilizer markets. Over to you, Delphine.
Thank you, Monika. Hi, everyone. I hope we can have the slides displayed. Thank you for the introduction, Monika. So today, the goal of my presentation is to give an overview of where we are at on fertilizer markets for the three main macronutrients, nitrogen, phosphate, and potash. It won't be completely exhaustive, but I hope it will fuel the conversation that comes later. So we'll start by having a look at the current price levels for the different macronutrient markets. We are having a situation where nitrogen and potash markets, which are displayed in green and red color in this chart, have experienced slight but continuous increase since the beginning of 2025, with values still in the range that we could have experienced before the 2021-2022 crisis, but still in a firmer tone since the beginning of the year. The story is a bit different, as we will see, for phosphate markets, the blue line on this chart, where the current price levels have been suffering an increase since the beginning of the year, but that was already an increasing trend since the end of 2023. So how to explain the situation on those different markets and the support we've seen since the beginning of 2025? If we look at manufacturing costs for fertilizers, and that will be the next slide, please, we will have a view on the evolution of production costs for ammonia. Ammonia being the building block produced from natural gas, and that is necessary to produce all kinds of nitrogen fertilizers and also the main phosphate fertilizers like diammonium phosphates and monoammonium phosphates. So if we look at the production cost for ammonia, in particular in Europe, which is the marginal cost producer of ammonia, we have a situation where the current cash costs are close to 15% higher than they were last year for the average since January till September 2025. However, even if prices have been higher this year as compared to previous year, we are in a situation where current values are pretty similar to what we could have experienced in 2019, 2020. So even if production costs for ammonia are a supportive factor, they do not explain by themselves the supportive trend we've seen on fertilizer markets. If we look more closely at the phosphate story, as I mentioned earlier, we have a more sustained market. We can also have an estimated calculated cost for diammonium phosphate, DAP, and we're seeing that current values not only are higher than they were last year in terms of production cost for phosphates, but they're also more than 130% higher than they were previous to the 2021-2022 crisis. So we do have more supportive factors from the production costs on the side of phosphates. However, when we look at the actual market price for phosphates, there is a disconnect, and phosphate fertilizer and fertilizers markets are in comparison even higher than the production costs. So that's on the one side, looking at the cost of producing fertilizers. If we move forward and try to look at individual fertilizer markets, if we start with nitrogen on the next slide, we will be looking at the evolution of exports and imports for the major players of urea market, urea being the most important nitrogen fertilizer traded globally. So the story here is that the urea market has been slow this year as compared to what we experienced in previous years. The main factor driving this nitrogen market, or this urea market in particular, has been the quasi-absence of China on the global market. China being a major exporter of urea, but China has been keeping resources for internal use, domestic use, and in the case of urea, there was virtually not a drop of urea being exported last year. That's a big change from what we saw in the past, because that removes up to 4 million tons of urea from the global market. In this context, importers need to look for alternatives. So looking at other potential suppliers of urea on global markets, we can look at the Middle East, but tensions in the Middle East have been fueling the uncertainty in this market. In particular, we may remind the events we had over Iran, who is a major urea exporter, last June, in a critical moment when India, a big importer, was buying. We may look for alternatives of supply from North Africa, for instance, but the potential of exports out of Egypt and Algeria is capped, in particular in a context where access to natural gas is sometimes a challenge. And we may look at other exporters from Nigeria, who has increased drastically exports in the last few years, but bringing tons from a faraway origin like Nigeria all the way to India, for instance, does come with an increased logistical cost. So when you remove part of the supply potential from the top exporters and you're a major importer, and I mentioned India, you're in a situation where it's hard to secure tons and you may need to pay up for nitrogen fertilizers. In a context where India is heavily subsidized, the demand for urea has been extraordinary, has actually exceeded expectations from the market. So India has been using up its domestic stocks and is now in a situation where it needs to replenish stocks and to make sure it will have sufficient urea available for the coming season. So this is a major player of demand who has been supporting prices on the market. I will not go through all the details. A lot of other things come at play in this context. Looking at the EU27, for instance, we're having a major role of the EU27 as an importer of urea, and a lot of trade discussions. Imports from Russia are a critical aspect for the EU. The CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, also comes at play, and I'm sure my colleagues will touch upon that in the coming discussion. The story is very different for phosphates, as we said earlier. So if we move to the next slide, we're having a situation where availability of phosphates has also decreased because of China reducing exports of phosphates. But in this case, there are no alternative for users of phosphates. You cannot really push for more exports out of Morocco or Saudi Arabia in the current context. And you do not have alternative products as you would have in nitrogen, for instance. So if you do not achieve to buy phosphates on the international market, you're stuck. So that's why we've seen an increase in prices, a continuous increase in prices for phosphates in the last years because of a situation of very tight supply. You have a particular case in the US where imports from different origins to the US markets are subject to countervailing duties since the last few years. And again, that makes the situation a bit more complicated, in particular for US farmers in the context of phosphates. Last but not least, if we look at the potash market, we are in a situation, on the next slide, please. We're in a situation where trade has been recovering over the last few years, which is not the case for nitrogen and phosphates, as I mentioned earlier. So we're not facing a supply cut in the case of potash. There is more and more potash being made available on the international market. The situation has improved largely since the 2021-2022 crisis, after the COVID-19 and all the sanctions that were put on Russia and Belarus. And there are tons of potash being made available to the international market, but sometimes trade flows had to adjust to avoid sanctions and sanctioned destinations, and to potentially change logistics to get from one point to another. And additional logistics, once again, come with additional costs. So that's also a supportive factor in the case of potash, despite the fact that there is product being made available globally. I also call your attention on the fact that Israel is part of the top 5 exporters of potash globally. So even if we have not seen or experienced any loss in supply from Israel, the tensions and uncertainties linked to geopolitical tension in the area also provided support to the potash context. And finally, you need to keep in mind that potash is mostly consumed in countries like Brazil or Southeast Asia. In such countries, the price of crop commodities has been supportive for the use of potash. For instance, soybean prices in Brazil have been supportive, or palm prices in Indonesia, for instance, have also been supportive for the use of potash. So in this case, we're in a situation where supply is not limited, but logistical costs add up on price or on costs, and demand has been supportive for this market. All in all, even if the story is slightly different from a supply and demand perspective for all 3 nutrients, and if we move on to the next slide, please, we are in the 3 of those cases in a situation where firmer prices also come with deteriorated affordability of fertilizers as compared to crop prices. In this case, you have a set of indicators, fertilizer versus crop ratios in different areas of the world, and the higher the indicator, the less affordable the fertilizer would be for farmers. And we're seeing that in all 3 cases, affordability has been deteriorating since the beginning of the year, with a special, let's say, a specific increase in the case of phosphates, and that relates to all the different elements I provided earlier. And we actually see in this case, I just call your attention to the blue line for the phosphate affordability chart. That's affordability of phosphates in the US. Again, I insisted a bit earlier on the specific countervailing duties context in the US on top of all the tariffs that will be part of the discussion for my colleagues. In this case, there is a big question mark on the potential demand destruction for phosphates in the coming season in the US. There is a long time ahead before the start of the new season there, but I'm sure a lot of discussions will happen in the US, but also in all kinds of regions of the world. With that, I am done with the introducing remarks I had to make on the fertilizer markets, and I look forward to very interesting discussions with our colleagues. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Delphine, for the introduction, for walking us through the current situation on the markets. You indeed mentioned the changes in the US trade policies, and I would like to now welcome Shawn Arita, Research Associate Professor from North Dakota State University, to walk us through the US tariffs and their impact on fertilizer trade. Over to you, Shawn.
Thank you, Monika. So my name is Shawn. I'm with the Agricultural Risk Policy Center at NDSU. Today, I'm going to be talking about IEEPA tariffs. I'll provide an overview of these tariffs, why they're unusual, and how they're showing up in fertilizer markets. I'll then discuss what's happened to the U.S. imports of fertilizers under these tariffs and price effects. Next slide, please. So IEEPA stands for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It was passed in 1977. It gives the president broad authority to regulate trade if there's a national security threat. What's unusual today is how they're being used. Instead of targeting a narrow set of sanctions, it's being applied across the board to industrial, consumer, and agricultural products. The tariffs range from about 10 to 40%. The president can impose them without congressional approval. For fertilizer markets, this matters directly. Tariffs hit inputs like phosphates, urea, and some potash blends, but there are some exemptions. And so the impact isn't the same across all suppliers. Next slide, please. Earlier in the year, the administration imposed their first set of IEEPA tariffs, starting with Canada, Mexico, and China due to fentanyl border issues. Then the reciprocal tariffs with a baseline 10% tariff on nearly all imports. The specific hikes were then put on hold for about 90 days, but by the late summer, the higher rates were back in place, even as an appeals court ruled that they likely exceeded presidential authority. For now, though, they remain in place while the Supreme Court prepares to review the cases this fall. So the bottom line is that this isn't a flat one-time tariff, it's a shifting, evolving system. Next slide, please. These charts show where fertilizers are sourced from in the US. Canada is the dominant supplier of nitrogen and almost all of our potash, while phosphates are more spread out across several countries. But what I wanted to show you is the carve-outs. You'll notice in the charts that the shaded segments are the suppliers exempt from IEEPA tariffs. First, potash. Virtually all potash was exempted under presidential order. Second is Canada and Mexico, because those products do qualify under USMCA. They're exempt from the IEEPA tariffs. And finally, Russia. Interestingly, Russia was not included in the reciprocal tariff list, as well as Belarus. Next slide, please. When you take the carve-outs into account, the effective tariff on fertilizers from the IEEPA tariffs is actually pretty modest. This slide shows the trade-weighted effective tariff being faced on average by the US. The IEEPA tariffs are in yellow and MFN in green. I do not show any of the AD/CVD or trade remedy duties here. It's just the MFN and IEEPA tariffs. For potash, given all the exemptions, it actually comes out to be less than 1%. For nitrogen and phosphates, it's in the 5 to 10% range. So this is a lot lower than the roughly 15 or 16% average IEEPA tariff now currently being applied to overall US imports, but it's still a significant jump from the zero baseline we largely had before the IEEPA tariffs. Next slide, please. Now let's take a look at what actually happened to imports once the tariffs went into effect. This slide shows total US fertilizer imports before and after the IEEPA tariffs. By product, potash is down about 3%, nitrogen about 6%, and phosphates down the most, nearly 25%. Some of that phosphate decline is likely reflected by demand destruction for price issues outside of IEEPA for some of the reasons that Delphine had explained earlier. But we are likely seeing some degree of these IEEPA tariffs taking hold. It's also worth noting that while potash was ultimately granted a broad exemption, there was still a lot of uncertainty earlier this year. Importers weren't first sure whether these shipments would be covered, and there was a cloud of uncertainty likely contributed to this early dip in volumes. But the big picture is that the fertilizer imports have declined, but behind those numbers, the story is more complex. Some suppliers have fallen away while exempt suppliers have picked up the slack. Next slide, please. So this slide breaks down import changes separately across fertilizers hit by IEPA tariffs and those that were exempt. The red bars show the IEPA tariffied products, and there the declines are steep. Potash imports dropped by nearly 3/4. That's actually a very, very small group that was non-exempt, very small amount of tariff lines for potash. But nitrogen fell about 30%, and phosphates were down about 20%. But the exempt categories, again, they tell a very different story. These are the green bars. Those actually grew for phosphates. They rose about 20%, and potash held up better than the IEPA affected groups. And then there's Russia. The blue bars show their shipments, which were exempt. These flows really stand out. Double-digit increases in both nitrogen and potash. In effect, U.S. buyers lean heavily on Russian supply to fill some of these gaps left by our other suppliers. That's helped fertilizer availability in the US, but it also creates vulnerability. Europe, for example, has recently imposed new sanctions on Russian fertilizers. If geopolitical tensions escalate further, or if Russian exports get disrupted, the US could find itself really exposed to Russia dependence. So the bottom line here is, though, that imports under the IEPA tariffs have fallen, exempt flows rose, especially from Russia. This adaptation has helped in the short run, but it leaves us more dependent on a risky source of supply, and it has not completely filled the gap. Next slide, please. So what has been the effect on prices? Are U.S. farmers paying more for their fertilizers? One way we can examine this is by looking at the price spreads of the U.S. with the rest of the world surrounding the imposition of the IEPA tariffs. So here we use Brazil's CIF prices as a reference point. If tariffs were really biting in terms of prices, we'd expect U.S. price premiums over Brazil to widen after the tariff imposition. So starting off on the left with urea, the U.S. premium over Brazil did rise a bit after the reciprocal tariffs, as we can see in that dotted line, but also lines up with the seasonal bump we usually see around this time. So it's not easy to say how much of this tariffs is normal market patterns. On the top right is MAP. For a while, the spread stayed pretty flat, but more recently, we have seen some upward trend in that price spread. And the bottom right is potash. Again, here, potash was largely exempt, so you don't really see too much of a change, and we shouldn't expect too much to begin with. So the takeaway is mixed. We have seen some hints of rising pressure in urea and MAP, but it's not definitive. And since potash was exempt, it serves as a good check, at least as a reference point. For now, global supply and demand still look like the main drivers, and the real test will be what happens when we head into the spring planting, when U.S. demand really picks up. Next slide, please. So to summarize, the IEPA tariffs are very broad and unprecedented. They have had meaningfully reshaped U.S. ag trade. While fertilizers do benefit from carve-outs and exemptions, imports under IEPA, including from nitrogen and phosphates, have declined. The full impact on prices is not entirely clear. What we've seen is not a uniform global spike, but more of a redistributive shift in sourcing and localized pressure points in the U.S. Some regions may feel supply tightness, but the main factor are those supply and demand factors that Delphine had highlighted earlier, export restrictions by China and global strength in demand. So the structure of U.S. purchasing has changed. We are sourced now for more of the exempt suppliers, notably Russia, and that has increased our exposure to geopolitical risk and future trade shocks. Thank you for your attention. I look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you for walking us through the U.S. tariff developments and the implications on trade. Now, your presentation and Delphine's presentation set the stage really nicely for the next speaker. So we now have a better understanding of the markets and appreciation of how they are changing. So I would like to invite Ruth Hill, Director of the Markets, Trade and Institutions Division from IFPRI, to kind of square this whole discussion for us. How it bonds with the policy reform and the fertilizer use. Over to you, Ruth.
Thank you very much, Monika, and thank you for everybody for being online for this discussion today, and for the two previous speakers for their great presentations. So yeah, as Monika mentioned, I'm going to turn to look a little bit now at what the policy response might be to some of the changing market conditions that we're seeing, and particularly looking at, what's the typical response to addressing fertilizer affordability, particularly as we see some concerns that this is that, you know, affordability is worsening, particularly when we look at this ratio of fertilizer prices to output prices. So if we could go to the next slide. So often in moments when we've seen in the past that affordability of fertilizer is a concern, fertilizer subsidies are often seen as the solution. We particularly see concerns when this being a concern in economies where underuse is already a challenge. Fertilizer subsidies are a popular policy instrument in these moments, and particularly in these contexts, because they directly target the concern. They're politically visible, and they also have an immediate effect, and they're relatively simple policies to implement. So as a result, as you can see from the figure on the right, which uses data from the Ag Incentives Consortium database, input subsidies tend to be a really large share of agricultural sector spending, particularly in low-income and lower middle-income countries. If we could go to the next slide. So the question that we're asking today is, you know, is this the best policy option for addressing affordability? And there's many sort of concerns raised over using subsidies despite their attraction. There's a concern that this is actually a really blunt instrument to address a complex set of drivers that drive underuse. Affordability depends on a lot of things. One is indeed this price ratio, the ratio of the price of fertilizer to the price of outputs. But affordability also depends on how effective the fertilizer is when used. We know that when soil quality is poor, that the expected returns to adding nutrients, such as nitrogen, are just not present. Similarly, when water management is weak, there's really high uncertainty of returns, particularly in the context of increasingly sporadic rains. There's also concerns around fertilizer subsidies that when they're in place and when maybe we don't have these soil quality or water management constraints, that subsidies can actually lead to overuse of some fertilizers. We also have concerns that they can stymie private sector development of input markets and can sometimes bias production choices, as even though they may not be targeted to a specific crop, they are de facto more used in certain production of certain crops than others, so can bias that crop choice production decision as well. So I think the evidence is there that these are not always the most high return policies to be using to increase productivity. So it's a good question to ask is, you know, are these the best policy tool to really be using in these moments for addressing this affordability question? So if we could go to the next slide. So we can contrast all that evidence on the fact that fertilizer subsidies may not be the best, most high return policy to be using. But the reality is, as I mentioned earlier, they're a very popular policy instrument, and there's good reasons why they're popular. So some of these reasons why they're popular are that they have these immediate benefits. So subsidies have an impact in the current production season. And so it really makes them quite attractive for addressing short-run food security needs, or particularly to deal with some of these fluctuating market conditions. We can compare this to example for investing in agricultural research and development, which we know is a very high return investment, but is an investment that yields returns over the much longer run. Another reason that they're popular is that they are very visible policies that give a direct, tangible benefit to farmers, and this makes them very politically popular. It's a clear way for a government to show that they're doing something and that they are supporting farmers and supporting food production in the country. We could contrast this to, for example, investments in public information systems, which may indeed have a big benefit, but may not have that sort of tangible, direct benefit to farmers. The third reason why subsidies are popular is that they're simple to implement compared to some other policies. There's implementation challenges for sure with any policy that's implemented, and I'm not saying that fertilizers subsidies don't have any implementation challenges, but those challenges are much smaller than, for example, increasing extension, which requires training a whole cadre of extension workers, or some other policies that are much more involved to implement. So as we think about what alternative policies could be used to address this question of how to increase appropriate use of fertilizer, it's really important that we think of policies that share some of these characteristics of fertilizer subsidies that make them so popular. So we need to be thinking about policies that do have immediate benefits, that have a visible direct benefit to farmers, and that are relatively simple to implement. Some good alternatives to these, to fertilizer subsidies that share these characteristics are things like soil testing and soil fertility management, financing for small-scale irrigation, payments for ecosystem services, although they may take slightly longer to have a benefit. So these are all things that we can be looking at, and I'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slides. As I've mentioned, some other investments are needed, but they're not as good alternatives because they don't have some of these characteristics. So some of the work that we're doing here at IFPRI and in the CGIAR is really looking at testing and getting alternatives to fertilizer subsidies to scale. So we're undertaking work to test policy instruments that are easy to implement, that are good approaches to addressing these challenges in a sustainable and fiscally responsible way. And we're also working with governments to not just be testing these on a pilot basis, but really thinking about how we take these to scale and ensuring that we're finding alternatives that can indeed be scaled. So in my last remaining minutes of the presentation, I'm just going to talk about a couple of things some examples that look promising, where we have seen good results in pilots and where we are also seeing these being able to go to scale. So if we go to the next slide. So the first one is providing site-specific, low-cost information. There's different ways of doing this that really increase productivity gains. This could be site-specific agronomic information, as in the example for Ethiopia that's on the slide, or this could be very easy to use tests that allow farmers to get the doses of nitrogen they're applying correctly, as in the example of Bangladesh on the right hand of the slide. Both of these are interventions that have been shown to either increase yield use or reduce the costs of production by ensuring the appropriate application of inputs rather than overuse or underuse. The nice thing about these is that they're both things that are increasingly able to scale. So for example, the site-specific agronomic information, in the past, this was something that was very difficult to scale, but it is increasingly something that we can scale through the advances in digital and AI advisory services. In terms of the nitrogen tests, we are seeing some of these color leaf charts really being used at scale in India and in Bangladesh this year. And this shows real promise in terms of having something that can go to scale at fairly low cost and bring about real benefits in productivity and reducing costs for farmers. If we could go to the next slide. So talking about one other area, which is how to improve soil health in the long run. And here I've put some examples where, yes, the goal is improving soil health in the long run, but through either the practices that are being used or the policy instruments that has been used to encourage the types of investments that are needed, there's been a benefit to the farmers in the short run as well, which is a really important need for any policy that would replace a fertilizer policy. So in Niger, farmers provided training plus cash transfers to construct demi-lunes. In fact, it was found that it really was the training that made the difference here. And that already, even though this was an intervention that was building soil health over the long run with benefits in the long run, this was something that was already increasing production and value in the year after it was implemented. In Ethiopia, this was a much longer run intervention, but the nice feature of the Ethiopia example is this was a nationally run scheme. So there's something really implemented at scale, but showing how these safety net linked investments in landscape management and in soil health really brought about substantial increases in productivity and resilience. And by providing cash transfers to households in the short run, they were able to ensure a benefit to farmers in the short run also. So there's some examples of where we might see alternatives. I think the real challenge is to be able to build up the evidence base on what works and what can really go to scale, so that when policymakers are looking at how to address this very real concern of affordability of fertilizer and underuse, that they're able to have a multiple set of policy instruments that they can use and not just need to use fertilizer subsidies as the only option. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you for giving us the summary. I particularly appreciated the list of alternatives and the considerations on how they can be scaled up. With this, I would like to move to the next segment, for which I'm inviting Charlotte to join me and moderate the exchange with our two experts, Maria and Veronica, who should also join us at this point. Over to you, Charlotte.
Thank you so much, Monika, and thank you to all of the speakers in our first part of the seminar. Really very excellent overviews of where we are today. So as Monika said, we're going to have we're entering our discussion period, and we're kicking things off with our two panelists. And I'm going to be asking each one of them 2 questions, and they'll provide short answers, and then we'll move into the broader Q&A. So again, encouraging all of you watching us to please submit your questions on your various platforms. So let's start with Maria Antip. Maria Antip is a fertilizer consultant with the FAO. It's a great pleasure to have you with us, Maria. We heard a lot from our 3 speakers about the recent changes in tariffs, mainly due to the change in US tariffs. But we know that the past few years have been quite turbulent, right? We had significant changes in fertilizer markets as a result of the COVID-19 shutdowns. And then, of course, because of the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And I'd like for you just to briefly remind us, what were the key impacts of that invasion and the ongoing war, and how much of those are still playing an important role today?
Thank you very much, Charlotte. Hello to everyone. Thank you to the previous speakers and the co-chairs. So to begin addressing your question, Charlotte, I'd like to say that volume-wise, fertilizer trade in 2024 basically returned to the levels of 2020, 2021 volume-wise. In 2025 to date, when we compare, fertilizer trade is lagging behind. It's about 4 million tons behind the prior year. And this is largely on account of unfavorable weather conditions in the Northern Hemisphere, but also due to affordability concerns in key fertilizer import markets such as India and Brazil. When we look at impacts of the war, production-wise, we have seen a reduction in fertilizer production in Ukraine, of course. They went from exports of around 1 million to 1.5 million tons of mostly nitrogen to near zero exports. Where production has been curtailed, it was due to unreliable access to natural gas supply, but also due to concerns around safety, shelling, bombings, etc. But actually, since mid-2024, domestic production of fertilizer in Ukraine has largely resumed, with the exception of one ammonia plant located at Odessa port. But all of these volumes produced now by Ukraine are being used domestically. Prior to the war, Ukraine exported close to 1 million tons of urea to India. And since the war, actually, Russian exports of urea to India have increased by a similar factor, showing interestingly, near perfect substitution of origins for this particular case. Elsewhere, in terms of trends on productions and trade, we've also seen, let's say, a more increased presence on the international markets of producers like Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan. These produced fertilizer before, but they are now more, let's say, motivated to go deeper into the global markets, into other regions. In addition, key exporters of urea and nitrogen, such as Nigeria, have expanded their production capacity and have now a more prominent role on the international market. From a logistic perspective, I have to say that supply chains have proven quite flexible, and exporters were rather quick in adjusting to new shipping routes. For example, Russia shifted quite quickly from shipping potash and nitrogen via Latvia and Lithuania, and now they exclusively direct their trade through their own ports, and they even built a new major port on the Black Sea in Taman. Other sanctioned countries, such as Belarus, have become increasingly dependent on Russia to export their fertilizers, particularly potash in the case of Belarus. Another important consequence, if you'd like, almost a positive externality of this new global situation, is that some producers and exporters have increased their efforts into reaching previously underserved markets, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Latin America. And this is because other key importers are either voluntarily sanctioning or have applied almost prohibited tariffs on Russian fertilizers. So Russian producers are now directing these volumes, mostly again nitrogen, but also phosphates, to less mature markets where they have invested in developing inland supply chains and achieving that last mile delivery. It's also worth noting that, and this speaks obviously to Delphine, but also Ruth's presentations, that in a post-COVID world, fertilizer access issues have been rather on the affordability side and not so much on the availability or even logistics. Trade barriers, which Delphine evidenced previously, including seasonal ones, namely the export controls in China on urea and phosphates, have had a significant effect on market dynamics and will likely continue to shape the markets going forward, particularly for urea and phosphates.
Fantastic. That's a really a good overview of what happened as a result of the war and what continues to play out in fertilizer markets. Let me ask you a quick follow-on question. There's a lot of excitement and perhaps some hype about green or blue ammonia, which is either zero or low carbon ammonia production produced through electrolysis. Can you give us a little bit of a snapshot of, are we beyond the stage of pilot projects now? Is there actually commercial production now of low carbon ammonia? And how likely is that to scale up further? And then what do you think are going to be the key impacts if there is such increased production and trade? What does it mean for global fertilizer markets?
Absolutely. Thank you for this very important question. So indeed, low carbon ammonia has emerged as a critical lever for decarbonizing the global fertilizer production. But I have to say that its large-scale deployment remains at an early stage. Traditional ammonia production, which is the basis for all nitrogen-based fertilizers and even some phosphates, namely MAP and DAP, still heavily rely on fossil fuels and have a significant impact on global CO2 emissions. I have to say that the shift toward low carbon alternatives, whether they be blue or green, offer an opportunity to cut emissions significantly, but there are still policy and commercial hurdles along the way. For example, global ammonia production, traditional gray ammonia, if you'd like, is around 190 million tons per year. And 80% of that is then converted into fertilizers such as urea, nitrates, and ammoniated phosphates. We have seen quite significant progress on blue ammonia, which uses carbon capture and storage to decrease that, let's say, carbon footprint. And there has been some scaling up, which with commercial production, going up in the U.S. Gulf and several products in several projects in the Middle East, but it still remains limited. When we talk about green, this potential supply is even more limited. And let's say experts project up to 3 to 4 million tons by 2028 of potential green ammonia production. So as you can tell, that's a small fraction of the total global demand. So while, green fertilizers may be in reach, we're still quite a long way from displacing conventional production. However, and I think it's interesting to mention, trials do exist. For example, recently, last year, a Dutch nitrogen producer sold a trial of green CAN, calcium ammonium nitrate, to an Irish distillery. So basically to grow barley and make whiskey. So there is somewhere presumably low carbon whiskey, which I find quite interesting. And just recently, last week, a major Norwegian nitrogen producer partnered with a green ammonia project in Paraguay for an offtake of 100,000 metric tons of green CAN per year. So once this production comes on stream, estimated in 2028, again, that's 100,000 metric tons of green fertilizer going to the market. So while the potential is there, and there is potential to completely alter trade routes just because production of green ammonia will be geographically tied to regions that are abundant in renewable energy. So Southern Europe, we have a project in Spain. North Africa, there are projects in Morocco and one proposed one in Tunisia, Middle East, and Australia. So this will gradually shift fertilizer trade patterns, and countries that are renewable rich have a comparative advantage. We already have project announcements in Morocco and Saudi Arabia. So these are two leaders in the phosphate industry that are looking ahead and plan to, have this green ammonia to produce their phosphates.
Fantastic. I think we'll stop there. Thank you so much, Maria. That's a great overview. I would say that in addition to the likely positive impact on carbon emissions from green ammonia, there is potentially a huge impact on production around the world, right? I think the holy grail in green ammonia is if you could produce it at a smaller scale in the developing world, which of course does have comparative advantage in renewable energies, right? So that, but I think you make the point that we're still quite a ways off, I think, from that happening. But I think that's a really interesting thing to keep an eye on. So thank you, Maria. Let's shift over to Veronica Nigh. She is working with the Fertilizer Institute here in the US. It's the US Industry Association, and she is their chief economist. Veronica, our first presenters already gave a very good overview of the changes in US tariffs. Now, TFI is a very diverse association. So you have big producers, you have exporters, you have importers. Give us a feeling for how these changes are playing out among your membership.
Yeah, thanks very much for including us in this really interesting webinar today. So as you said, we represent the whole value chain here in the United States. So that includes anyone basically who touches fertilizer, who sells fertilizer or produces fertilizer in the US. So that's producers, that's importers, that's wholesalers, and retailers of fertilizer. So as has been discussed by Delphine and others, our job has really been to share all of those facts that fertilizer is a globally traded commodity where the US tax code and policies of governments around the world can impact manufacturing, distribution, and end use, not only within the industry, of course, but with US policymakers, the growing community, and the media. Because our industry is complicated, and frankly, data is not nearly as available about the fertilizer industry as really it is in other areas of agriculture. And so our job at TFI and our global sister industry association, the International Fertilizer Association, is to shine some light on those trade patterns to help other folks understand these trade patterns a little bit better, so that when we do have these disruptions, when we do have geopolitical challenges, that it's much easier to understand those variations in price and trade flows. And I think here in the US, an important element for us has also been to help all of those involved differentiate between trade remedies that are leveled at the US ITC versus those that have been put in place more recently through executive powers. The US has, until somewhat recently, had some of the lowest tariffs in the world, and we've gotten a little out of practice about talking about tariffs. And so we have had a tendency over the last 9 months to lump them all together. A tariff is a tariff is a tariff. And that's not really the case. And so we've had to sort of relearn how tariffs are applied and by whom, and at what, how the frequency and the mechanism by which those tariffs can be applied and therefore or removed. So that's been also an endeavor across all of those different stakeholders that we talked about earlier.
Great. Thanks, Veronica. Let me ask you another question, which is, and people spoke about it earlier as well, right? We have the fertilizer to crop price ratio. How are you seeing U.S. farmers right now amidst both the fertilizer tariffs, but also we know, of course, that there is a potential for counter tariffs that could be imposed on U.S. farmers as a result of the U.S. tariffs. And in China, it's interesting, right? Because there is no tariff. China has not really imposed a tariff on soybeans, but they've essentially stopped importing soy from the U.S. At this point in time. It's unclear whether they can keep that up, but that's where we are now. So what is the mood of the farmers here at this point in time, given changes both on the fertilizer tariffs, but also importantly on the commodity products?
Yeah, I think, Charlotte, this has been an area that's been the most surprising for a non-US audience. Because at large, the US ag community has been a large and pretty loyal support base for the Trump administration in both the first iteration and now in the second administration. Surveys of growers have shown that they believe that a Trump administration will provide more regulatory certainty, as well as a much more positive view on the US's long-run ag trade prospects. So I'll give you an example of the Purdue University CME Group Ag Economy Barometer, which is a nationwide measure of the health of the US ag economy that provides it at an index value level. So the index is based on a survey of 400 producers on economic sentiment each month. So despite low commodity prices that have persisted throughout the entire 24-25 growing season, the barometer jumped markedly when President Trump was elected, and it reached a 4-year high in May. The barometer has since fallen as producer confidence in the future has waned some, especially among crop producers, but still the index remains at the same level as it was around harvest of 2022, when commodity prices were much, much higher. So as one sort of reads into that barometer, producers believe that this administration will find a way to be on their side, to find a way to help them out in their time of need. In the first Trump administration, they found a way to provide additional support to the growing community when China did during the first exchange of tariffs and the drop off in demand from China. And so there is a bit of history there to support that grower sentiment and belief that would occur. So I think the belief that the administration will provide some backstop has likely muted that production response that might have been expected in this growing year otherwise.
Great.
But next year's planting decisions and as a result, fertilizer use patterns are going to be highly impacted by what happens in Washington in the next 6 months. And like I said, that barometer peaked back in May and has since fallen off in the last couple of months, but not nearly as much as you might expect if you're just watching what has been happening in US commodity markets over the last, frankly, 2 years.
So that's really an interesting point, I think, for our international audience here, right? And I think there's a willingness by, let's say, U.S. farmers as a whole to take some bumps in the road, right? Because they believe that in the long run, things will turn out all right for them. But as you say, that barometer does seem to be coming down a little bit. So we'll that's certainly, I think, an interesting space to watch. Thank you very much to both Maria and Veronica. We're now there'll be more questions coming your way as well as for our additional speakers. And I'm going to hand the baton back over to Monika to kick off the Q&A with our audience.
Thank you, Shawn. Thank you for starting with Veronica and Maria. So we have questions coming in, but please don't be shy. Put more questions in the question box on the social media. In the meantime, we spoke about the US farmers. I would like now to combine a few questions that came in and ask you in particular, perhaps we could hear from Veronica, Maria, and Delphine, is that we heard about key market uncertainties affecting global fertilizer supplies. How do these challenges impact the ability of low and middle income countries to secure adequate amounts of fertilizer? And aren't these quantities actually sufficient to meet their needs? This goes very well with the question that was left by an anonymous spectacle, that despite significant developments in the fertilizer sector in India, farmers suffered greatly in obtaining the required quantity of urea to use in the existing rice crop. What would be the way out? So perhaps we can start with Delphine, from whom we haven't heard for a while. Over to you, Delphine.
Yes, thank you, Monika, and thank you for the questions. Maybe to address the first question, the first thing we can put in front of the audience today is the lack of reliable data on a lot of countries that does not allow us to have necessarily a very clear picture of how imports of fertilizers for those heavily reliant countries on imports from outside, how those imports are paying. The second aspect to consider is also how fertilizers are often heavily subsidized. So you would have governments envelopes covering at least for a certain amount of fertilizers for the higher prices that we've been experiencing on the international market. Of course, that has an impact in terms of envelopes and government budgets. And also, you know, for a given or a fixed amount of subsidies in a given envelope for a given year, you would have the government have less ability to cover more volumes. So potentially you would have an impact at the farm level to have less quantities being subsidized. The other aspect that seems to be taking more and more importance in many countries, and I'm thinking Sub-Saharan Africa, is also the search for alternatives to mineral fertilizers, or at least ways to either increase the efficiency of the few tons of fertilizers being applied, or bringing more nutrients from other sources like organic fertilizers. We're seeing, and I'm having the example of Senegal in mind, how the government is including now, since the last 3 years, organic fertilizers in their subsidy budgets. So we're seeing some alternatives to try and level out a little bit the situation on the international market. So that's a couple of hints. Maybe my colleagues here would have more ideas to share to the audience.
Thank you. Who would like to take over? Maria?
Maybe I could complement Delphine's wonderful exposition by adding and touching on actually Ruth's presentation on subsidies and just policy efficiency. The example of India and the anonymous person in the audience who asked a question and said that access by farmers is still limited. Indeed, and I would argue again, it is not an issue of availability. Quintessentially, the product is being produced. It's a matter of the efficiency of the subsidy policy, and many of you will know that India's nutrient-based subsidy heavily favors nitrogen and urea, to the point that farmers opt to buy the cheaper fertilizer, although that is not in some instances the correct fertilizer, the appropriate fertilizer to be used. As to access by these lower middle income countries, I mean, there are a series of tools. There are bulk purchasing schemes like in Tanzania. There are regular tenders, Ethiopia, India, and these, let's say, developing countries that are becoming more savvy about timing their purchases and about having, let's say, a collective approach to securing these inputs.
Thank you, Veronica.
I would just share something that I've been sharing with our grower audiences here in the US, that we point out regularly, that only about 10-11% of global fertilizer consumption happens in the United States. And when we look at use patterns of fertilizer around the world, in the US, it's highly dominated by corn usage, right? But in other parts of the world, a lot more crops matter. And when we look then at what global commodity prices have done over the last year, it is not the commodities that the US is particularly good at growing that have performed well on year-over-year price increases. When we look at things like sunflower oil, coffee, palm oil, rubber, barley, those that have done particularly well, those aren't things that we necessarily grow here in the United States. So that's just something that is not necessarily a thing that growers here typically think about, that they are in competition with growers around the world, that relative prices of commodities matter. And so I would just note that is something that we're trying to share and make better known, that these are indeed global commodities, and those commodities doing better in middle and low income countries helps their relative position and purchasing power relative to the commodities that are maybe more widely discussed and talked about in countries like the United States.
Thank you. Before I pass over to Charlotte, there is a follow-up about India, and I think I would direct it to Mania. Mania, and the question related to the shortage of urea during the rice season in India. Is there any linkages with the US trade policies, or those are two separate events?
I would argue those are separate events, but of course, the fertilizer markets, like any commodity markets, are very sentiment driven. So when there is uncertainty in one key destination market, there is uncertainty or maybe caution to act in others. However, I would argue that India this year has actually heavily imported urea. It has tendered 3 or 4 times since the beginning of summer. Again, speaking to favorable weather conditions, the farmers are motivated to buy this urea. But no, I would not see a direct linkage just between, let's say, United States policy uncertainty at one point and India's behavior.
Thank you. Over to you, Charlotte, for the next round.
Great, thanks, Monika. I have 2 questions I'm gonna tee up here that have come through through the chat. So the first is for you, Shawn, and Ruth, please do join us if you'd like on screen. Shawn, you spoke briefly about IEPA. Maybe for those in the audience that are not completely in the know about what is happening at this point in time in US courts, could you very briefly give us what is being teed up here in terms of the Supreme Court ruling that we expect within possibly a month or 2? And then after that, I'd like to turn to Delphine and maybe Maria as well as Ruth. So we heard that the US is actually placing tariff on urea imports from Nigeria, which is interesting to me because Nigeria has become a very significant producer of nitrogen over just the last few years. However, despite the significant demand for urea in Africa, most of those exports from Nigeria have gone off the continent. A lot of them have gone to Brazil and more, quite frankly, lucrative markets. But it's also because really, let's be honest, the fertilizer market, the value chain is really not significantly developed, say in West Africa, for them to be able to sell a lot within the region. So maybe Ruth, you could just briefly those of you could talk about Nigerian production, where you see that going now. And then Ruth, maybe what can be done to ensure that more fertilizer, which is actually produced on the continent, actually can stay on the continent, right? Because it is a place where we still have significant underuse of fertilizers. So let's start with Shawn and then Delphine and Maria and Ruth. Sure.
So IEPA, again, as I mentioned, one thing that really makes IEPA unusual is just how quickly it can be imposed with very little congressional oversight. Basically, the president has authority. They can push it in very quickly. It's very different than other trade actions that the U.S. has used in the past. For instance, Section 301 in the 2018 trade war. There's a process that takes there's a process that takes time. IEPA, it's very fast, and so that leads to this issue where it can cause potentially a lot of disruptions along the way. Now, I had mentioned that it is being challenged. The appeals court, the federal appeals court, has shot it down, but then they did grant a stay. So that was back in August. As Charlotte has mentioned, in November, the Supreme Court will review this case. So we can potentially have the president has asked for an expedited review. We could potentially have a decision on whether or not the IEPA tariffs will stay. But where it matters for fertilizers is that this feeds into the lingering uncertainty surrounding it. So when we had these IEPA tariffs put in place, it creates a tremendous burden for importers and exporters if they have to think through these tariffs. I mean, they basically have to think through two scenarios: one with the tariffs in place and one without the tariffs, whether the court actually strikes it down in November. So this leads to, once again, to higher costs, more volatility, more uncertainty. It makes long-term planning and investment very difficult. So just to emphasize, very quick uncertainty surrounding it, and we don't know where it's going to go in November. Nobody has a clear view of what the Supreme Court is going to do on it. Thanks. I'll stop there.
Great. And I guess the additional uncertainty perhaps down the road is if a trading partner of the U.S. decides to challenge this, say in the WTO, but of course there you have a national security exemption in WTO rules. So that's potentially more uncertainty regardless of the outcome of the Supreme Court, perhaps. So let's talk about the Nigerian production and the prospect of that, maybe more of that remaining in Africa. Delphine and Maria, did you want to come in on that?
Yes, sure. I can just to set the scene a little bit on the situation in Nigeria. So Nigeria has access to cheap natural gas resources that allowed the country to build manufacturing plants for urea and start exporting around 2018, if I remember correctly. Just to give you an idea, in 2019, Nigeria exported a bit up higher than 1 million tons of urea to the global market. And in 2024-2025 season, we're talking above 6 million tons exports. So that's considerable. The destinations of these Nigerian urea have been rather in the Americas and in Europe. We did see some Nigerian urea get all the way to India in 2022 when there was no short-term alternatives. But globally, indeed, Nigeria is exporting urea overseas more than to the African continent. I'm not saying that there are no Nigerian urea in any African country, but really the bulk of it is going overseas. There are several considerations to keep in mind here. First of all, we're talking bulk exports to overseas markets. The infrastructure in Africa is not developed enough to absorb big volumes of urea from Nigeria, the way Brazil would do, for instance. And then we're also talking in many African countries of needs at the farm level, very small quantities, very spread across different countries. So the logistics and the cost to bring that tons to African farmers are significant. To give you an idea, just a ballpark number, the difference between import prices and farm levels, the intra-country logistical costs in the US are around 14%. In Africa, we're talking about cost of close to 50% of the overall cost. So this is a key area where African countries would need to keep developing their interior infrastructure and their own markets to be able to absorb tons from Nigeria. And then you need to consider the ability to pay of African farmers as compared to the ability to pay of a Brazilian farmer, for instance. So we're talking a lot of different aspects to work on before being able to get those Nigerian tons spreading more across Africa. And Maria, you may have some more considerations to bring to the table.
Yes, thank you, Delphine. So indeed, infrastructure is a big difficulty. And so far, where we have seen efficient or successful distribution of African-produced fertilizer within sub-Saharan Africa, it has always been, or often been an action by the respective producer. So we have a major Moroccan producer that has undertaken, significant work in building those supply chains. Previously, we had a Norwegian producer that was having a similar effort. So it would really take the Nigerian producer to have the incentive and the policy support, government support, if you'd like, to build up those logistics. And just looking at the numbers, Ethiopia closed a urea import tender today for 500,000 tons, and its prices, the offers it's received, are quite competitive now compared to the return of selling those same tons in Brazil. But if we look at where Nigeria is placed and when Ethiopia is placed, obviously navigating around the Cape of Good Hope or having really good truck logistics to really cross the African continent is challenging. So in order for these projects to advance, there has to be policy support and mandates that go beyond just a boardroom.
I love the real-time intelligence on the markets. Thank you, Maria. So I think you've teed it up really nicely here for Ruth, right? So in a way, that the African governments have this commitment to try to increase fertilizer use. They had a huge soil health and fertilizer summit a couple of years ago, and yet the markets are still really underdeveloped. What can we do in this space to try to expedite market development so that more of that African production can actually serve African farmers?
Yeah, I think Delphine and Maria, mentioned a lot of the key points. And it's really about developing regional markets for trade. And I think we can sort of look to the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement as a really positive, statement also of support for the desire to do this. And then there's a lot of pieces, as have been mentioned, that go into making this a reality. A lot of this is around sort of hard infrastructure costs to make this possible. Some of this is also around regulatory issues that affect levels of investment in trucking fleet or shipping fleet in the continent as well. That's really needed to bring the costs down. And then also the policy certainty around the trade policies and sort of the non-tariff trade barriers that can really drive up the cost of trading between countries on the continent. So all these are really important areas where there is strong commitment for progress, and there is progress being made, but more is needed. I think some of the points made on also improving logistics in internal domestic markets within the continent is really important. And that's true for wherever fertilizer is coming from, right? But really important. I mean, that was a great statistic, Delphine, that you mentioned. Another one that sort of sticks in my head is that the cost of transporting across distance in Ethiopia or in Nigeria is 4 to 5 times the cost of transporting across distance in the US. And so this is for any good, for both. This is going to affect the affordability of fertilizer in 2 ways, right? It's going to affect the cost of fertilizer to farmers, but it's also going to affect the price that they get for the goods that they produce. So addressing this is also a really, really key part of addressing affordability of fertilizer use, wherever that fertilizer is sourced from.
Great. Thanks to all of you. Back over to you, Monika.
Thank you, Charlotte. Ruth, I would stay with you for the next question, because when you describe the fertilizer policies, in many countries, they are quite entrenched, right, in the system. So there could be reasons, sound economic reasons to get rid of them, yet they might not be really the political will to do so. So what do you think, or what strategies might prove effective in actually taking the let's call it the reform or adjustments forward to make this happen? Over to you, Ruth.
Yeah, this is a really great question. Thanks, Monika, for the question. I guess there's sort of maybe two points to make here. So one is taking some lessons from reform of energy and food subsidies, where there's a lot more experience in terms of trying out policy reforms and learning from places where policy reforms have been able to stick versus places where they haven't. I think one thing that we see being really important for being able to reform in a way where there's stability over the reform proposal is really replacing, not just taking something away, but having something very clear that it's being replaced, that the subsidy is being replaced with. So a good example here is Indonesia, when they were reforming their food and energy subsidies. Before removing subsidies, there was they implemented a quite large safety net program that was already in place, that they already put in place before taking the subsidies away. So this wasn't a sort of, we'll take your subsidy away and then we'll give you this other policy is going to come later. They made sure this other transfer was in place before removing the subsidies. And then gradually over time, they were able to narrow the targeting of the cash transfer program so that it targeted a more and more precise share of the population over time. But having that sort of fairly generous transition support in the moment of transition was really important when these subsidies that had been benefiting all of the population were removed. A second good example, I think, is really around the process. And so we have a nice example from Denmark from recently. So recently, Denmark has instituted the Green Denmark Agreement, which is a really transformative agreement that brings together consumers, farmers, businesses to come up with a set of policies that will, when implemented, really transform how agricultural production takes place in Denmark. And there's some things in there that are hard for certain stakeholders. There's going to be costs to them and it's going to require transition. But in the process of putting that agreement together, there was a strong emphasis on having all parties included in the discussions, of having an agreed sort of shared vision of where everybody wanted to get to, and taking the time to have intense stakeholder negotiations together. So I think there's a lot that can be learned from that process as well. So one thing sort of on the policy side, and then one thing on the process side.
Thank you, and thank you for giving us examples. There are a lot of questions from India. It could either demonstrate we have a lot of viewers in India on India as a significant player on the fertilizer market. So I would like to ask whoever can answer a market-related questions, what would be the implications of India if India eventually had to stop or chose to stop imports of fertilizer from the Russian Federation? What would be the implications of this move on the global markets? So perhaps Delphine or Monika can take it.
Yes, I can give some numbers. So first of all, India has indeed been importing fertilizers from Russia. For instance, in the case of urea, since 2022, we have Russia representing 15% of urea imports into India. So that's a significant amount of Russian product being absorbed into India. And keep in mind that's in a context where China has been reducing urea exports to India. So we've been seeing shifts like that in trade flows into India. If India decided to stop or reduce considerably imports from Russia, that would, let's say, free more volumes from Russia that Russia could be diverting to the international market. And in this context, I would refer to the comments that Maria made earlier about Russia pushing more marketing channels into different countries, in particular in lower and middle income countries. So that's the one element I can provide now. Maybe Maria, you want to add up to that.
Thank you, Delphine. Just to highlight that in this context, India and China are two sides of the same coin. So what happens if India stops importing Russian fertilizer, and mainly nitrogen in this case? Really, it depends, is China exporting or not at that point in time, whether it is those seasonal export controls or a major policy overhaul. So it's obviously it's interesting to have these counter scenarios, but these two giant buyer and users of fertilizer, China and India, it's difficult to imagine they would be decoupled in any, let's say, of their strategic trade policy.
Thank you. Let me ask one last question to Shawn before I pass the baton over to Charlotte about these shocks that we had about. Do these policies, Shawn, actually affect the global fertilizer demand, or they just merely redistribute the demand between the countries? What would be your answer?
Sure. So yeah, that's a great question. I think it's one where you have these shocks, but in terms of how they affect global markets, these are more, I would think it's going to be more redistributive in the sense where you have a localized impact on the US. It doesn't necessarily translate to higher global prices because you have these global forces that lead to readjustment. If these prices get higher, first of all, in the US, that leads to some degree of demand side destruction. That also makes the US less competitive. You'll have Brazil step in. They will expand their levels of production. They will increase their levels of fertilizer. So you have these offsetting features that take place whenever there's these bilateral tariff type of shocks that we're seeing here that don't necessarily translate into global shocks.
On a certain level, that is quite comforting to know. So over to you, Charlotte, for the next round.
Thanks. I just to follow up briefly on the India situation. Of course, the U.S. is already very much aware of the large increase in oil exports from Russia to India, right? That's been part of the tariffs. The U.S. tariffs that have been imposed on tariffs have been partially for that reason. I don't know if fertilizers are yet on their radar screen, but I think our speakers make it clear that those have also increased very, very significantly over the last few years, Russian exports to India. Maybe we could ask some of our market experts to talk a little bit about the Chinese export restrictions. Could you give us a feeling, sort of historically, how has China used export restrictions in order to protect sort of domestic farmers? And there's always a lot of speculation about how much there may actually already be, right? Maybe there are some stocks of fertilizers within China. Anybody want to sort of take a crack at that one? Delphine or Maria?
I can take it, Maria, if you want to start this time.
Sure. So historically, China has had seasonal export controls. So in times when Chinese application is in high demand, they have let's say modulated their exports to match their agricultural calendar. And that has been, let's say, traditionally ongoing, at least since I've been looking at these markets, so 10, 15 years. What has happened since COVID really, and really more so in 2021, is that China, as Delphine mentioned in her presentation, at least on urea, essentially halted its urea exports. And really, when assessing this move, it boils down to the cost of production. So what could have changed in China's energy matrix that made it so they wanted to stop essentially exporting energy, right? Whether it's natural gas or coal, which is another important feedstock for China. So I would say that's this part of the story on nitrogen. On phosphates, I would argue it's been really stating their increasing domestic need for phosphates, and they've continued to export some NPS, some blends, but they've been more judicious about DAP and MAP. Again, it's really hard to forecast how this might evolve, but I do not think that we will see a major change. So China will continue to be very likely an opportunistic exporter of fertilizer, be it P or N. And I hand it over to Delphine, who is really an expert on China, I would say.
Yes, maybe one nuance I would bring is we're talking about export restrictions from China to keep fertilizer prices affordable for domestic farmers. I think so. Besides protecting farmers locally, I think we need to think protecting resources also. We keep hearing about peak resources peak phosphorus. How at some point phosphorus is a resource that have limited horizon on given point of time, and experts would differ on when that is. But I think there is strategic management of resources that we are seeing in China on top of protecting farmers. And the other aspect, to add on what Maria was saying, we're also talking about opportunistic exports out of China in a context of seasonality of demand locally. I think the opportunistic behavior can also be seen in the current context of shifting trade policies, areas of influence, depending on how the US would be behaving, and then potential trade conflicts between China and other countries, or how there is some pressure from the US on Indian import behaviors, but then that's when China steps in again and unofficially accepting that Chinese urea exporters would work with India again. So there is an opportunism in terms of shifting trade relations globally that can also be a higher factor of uncertainty that we'll definitely keep watching in the coming months and years.
Fantastic. Maybe one last question for Veronica. We haven't talked that much about fertilizer use efficiency in this seminar, but that, of course, is a key issue when we're talking about some of the environmental impacts, right? So a low fertilizer use efficiency means that fertilizers are lost to the environment and have negative implications. Could you speak a little bit from the TFI's experience, which really worked with IFPRI at the time to develop the concept of the 4 Rs of proper nutrient management? Maybe it's important to just talk about that, and then maybe Ruth, for you to opine a little bit about how subsidy reform can also play into perhaps addressing some of the fertilizer use inefficiency problems that we see in parts of the world.
So if I may, perhaps Ruth can start because Veronica had to leave us. So Ruth, over to you.
Okay, sorry about that.
Thanks for the question, Charlotte. I think that this is a really nice question, because I think this is really the core of a lot of what we've been talking about, or when it comes to reforming fertilizer policies, is to try and encourage the efficient use of nutrients and to really have this as the goal. And I think what we're seeing is that in countries where we have a lot of underuse, there's often other things that are needed in order to ensure that the nutrients in fertilizers can be utilized properly in production. And so some of the sort of policy reforms are things that can be done to improve the ability for fertilizers to be used as efficiently as possible. So I think that's sort of it's a really nice question, because it's a really nice way to sort of frame a lot of, I think, what really is the essence of this conversation, which is, how do we have policies that ensure that these nutrients that are in fertilizers are able to have the biggest, I was going to say bang for the buck, but I guess we want bushel for the buck or something like that in this context.
Great. Thank you so much. So unfortunately, we have to slowly wind down what has been a really fantastic discussion. So a big thanks to my co-moderator, Monika, from the FAO for working so closely between Amos and IFPRI on this seminar, but also on the whole seminar series that we are doing jointly with Amos. A huge thanks to our speakers, and then also a really big thanks to IFPRI's event management team. Let me try just a very high level summary of these really interesting presentations we've had and discussions. So I think the big picture here is fertilizer markets remain quite concentrated, right? Because we know that they are produced in areas where you have access to the most affordable natural gas, or where you have access to the most in-ground potash and phosphate. So that is a reality, and it means that there are large producers that make up almost a large chunk of global production, and certainly an even larger chunk of global trade. So that makes this sector quite vulnerable to shocks. And so we've seen a series of shocks over the last few years. COVID was a big one, and certainly the invasion of Ukraine was a very significant one. And now so far, the jury, I think, is still out whether we're in for another shock or not. Certainly, the shock seems to be maybe more likely in phosphate than the other two macronutrients. But I think it's a space to be watched as we move forward. Green ammonia or blue ammonia would perhaps change both the carbon footprint of fertilizers, but also where it can be produced on the nitrogen side. So that would be perhaps a way to decouple a little bit fertilizer production from these more concentrated markets, or to have more markets producing, at least in the nitrogen sector, fertilizers. So I think those are very important. The topic of fertilizer subsidies is always very, very complex. We know, I think we did some time back a sort of back of the envelope calculation that subsidies account for roughly 50% of fertilizer demand around the world. So it's substantial. And I think that Ruth has laid out a really good case for reforming those subsidies. I think it is important to distinguish, say, between subsidies in India, which by and large tend to lead to overuse of urea. I think Maria made that point because of the respective pricing between the nutrients. So urea is as cheap as salt in India. So farmers, of course, will apply that much, much more than the other two nutrients. And then I think Africa is a little bit different because there is such underuse. And I think that some of the soil health issues that we see in Africa are actually the result of nutrient depletion, right? Because the soils are old and they have not been replenished with nutrients. So I think fertilizer use, in my view, will continue to be very, very important in Africa, not just to get yields up, but also for soil health. Now, of course, they have to be applied properly. You want to have a situation where Africa does not follow the same trajectory as we've seen in countries like Brazil or even India and China, where increased fertilizer use does bring up production, but it also becomes increasingly inefficient. So ideally, Africa can move from a point from increasing fertilizer use, but also increasing the efficiency of fertilizer use. So if they could just sort of leapfrog the curve that has taken place in other markets where increased fertilizer use meant initially less efficient fertilizer use. So I think that's the holy grail and something that would be important. But let me thank again all the speakers. I'm sure we will be coming back to the topic of fertilizer in a future seminar, and lots to be watching out for in this space. Many thanks to our audience. Thanks for your questions, and wishing you a good rest of the day wherever you may be joining us from.